Hey, welcome and thanks for joining me today for Fridays with Fenning. Last year, I got the opportunity to visit the King Centre, as in Martin Luther King Jr., the exhibition in Atlanta, Georgia. It was an incredibly moving experience as I read about his life, his fight for justice, for black rights, the horrendous actions of the Ku Klux Klan, his famous I Have a Dream speech, and then ultimately his assassination. And it was inspirational and heartbreaking all at the same time. You see, King was a man of courage, of conviction, of peaceful protest, and a real man of faith. But it showed me that those times seemed a world away from my own upbringing, my experience, and even my worldview. Growing up, I cannot remember one black child attending either primary or secondary school with me. I was 20 when I first got to work with my friend Carl McGregor, the black drummer in the Salt Mine Band, which means that my first 20 years of life included no racial diversity at all. So in watching the news and seeing those horrendous images on the streets of Minneapolis of George Floyd being pinned to the ground with the law enforcement officer's knee on his neck and hearing him say, "I can't breathe," over and over again until he died, was just both shocking and abhorrent. And since that moment, I've watched the Black Lives Matter campaign build here in the UK. The social media posts, the protest marches, the statues being pulled down of past slave traders. And until now, I've stayed quiet. I haven't known what to say or even how to say it. But staying quiet cannot be an option for me, or for you, or for anyone who cares about injustice, about humanity, and even more if we claim to have a faith in God who has made everyone in his image. You see, if I imagine George Floyd being replaced with my son having a knee on his neck, it's almost too upsetting to comprehend. But even that falls short of the ongoing injustices and racism and prejudice that black people have had to face all of their lives. So it's not good enough just to feel sorry for what's happened. I believe we are to grab this moment to own up and to stand up and make a difference. And what do I mean? Well, to own up is painful. But I recognise that in the past I've removed myself from the blame of racism. It hasn't been part of my world, so I'm not responsible for what happened, and I'm not responsible for sorting it. But to see the injustice of racism and take no ownership or responsibility is me being a priest or a Levite in the story of the Good Samaritan. They saw the wounded Jew and removed themselves from the situation. They ignored and just walked on by. He wasn't their responsibility. And in Jesus' story, they weren't applauded or affirmed. No, they're seen as the bad guys. Why? Because they ignored him and did nothing. Desmond Tutu once said this: "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." Now, I've come to the frightening conclusion that I'm more racist than I've realised. It struck me the other day that our church, the Forge, is predominantly white. And, well, that's understandable as we're in rural Suffolk and it reflects the local demographic. But we do have black families attending, and I don't really know them. I haven't worked hard at engaging with them or including them at the heart of our church community. And I am ashamed about that. And I put my hands up and I say, sorry, church, for not doing better. But I want to work at this, and I want to be much more inclusive in my language, in my attitudes, and in my behaviour. And maybe my confession will encourage you to do a bit of honest heart searching, to own up where you've got it wrong, and to allow God to open your heart to people who aren't the same as you, or necessarily hold the same worldview as you. So I believe we are to own up, to confess, and then we're to stand up and make a difference. And how do we do that? Well, we can do what lots of others have done and are doing. We can speak out about it. We can join the Black Lives Matter marches and we can post messages on social media. We can campaign to get rid of the statues of slave traders. And of course we can pray, and all of those things are good, but they need to come from a heart of authenticity, of understanding and of compassion. So how do we get that? Well, a change of heart has happened to me in another area of injustice. You see, throughout my life, I've known that poverty is a huge issue across the world. I remember the images of Ethiopia in the 1980s that kick-started Band-Aid and Live Aid. I've seen homeless people on the streets of Ipswich, and knowing about it just made little difference to me. But all of that changed in 2007 when I ventured out to South Africa to attend a Hands at Work conference. As soon as I arrived, I was put into a minibus and taken out into the community, where the houses were mud shacks or corrugated iron buildings, and children were living with their grandparents or older siblings because their parents had died of HIV. And I visited food centres, I saw the conditions they lived in, and I sat with them in their homes, and it was uncomfortable and I was lost for words. But it did something in me that changed my perspective. I had come alongside people and encountered their world and started seeing these people as real people, people like me, not just images on newsreels or in photos. You know, even visiting Denver and giving away coffees and listening and talking with street kids there changed my understanding and worldview of homelessness on our streets in the UK. Suddenly these people weren't just living on the streets because they'd made bad choices. No, all of them had painful stories that had led them to where they were now. Became less judgmental and more compassionate. And if my heart can be changed by God through those experiences, He can change my heart over the racism and injustice issues too, and help me to be anti-racist and to stand up and make a difference. Now, how am I really going to understand the issues that Black people and Asian people and Polish people face? Well, it's by getting to know them, befriending them and understanding their world. You know, we can all make a small difference where we are through how we treat people who don't look like us or have the same worldview as us. Andy Stanley, in his most recent talk at North Point Church, raised a brilliant question that I want to ask you too. And this question doesn't just relate to now, this relates to every day. And his question is this: how do people who don't look like you experience you? Not what do you think or feel about people who don't look like you? No, how do people who don't look like you experience you? And then he followed that up with the second question: how should people who don't look like you experience you? I tell you, this is such a great question because Jesus told us how people who don't look like us should experience us. He did. Just before Jesus was arrested and was crucified, he said this to his closest followers. He said, "A new commandment I give you." Not a new suggestion, but a new commandment. And what was it? It was to love one another. And then he qualifies it and he says, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another." In fact, throughout Jesus' life, he modeled this brilliantly because he befriended and invested and spent time with people who were nothing like him. And they liked him back. So Jesus says, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another." So how should people who don't look like me experience me? Well, like that, through me loving them. And what Paul does is Paul expands on what loving one another looks like. In Galatians 6 verse 2, he says, "Carry one another's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ." So when we choose to carry someone else's burden, we have a better understanding of their life, of their struggles, of their pain, and the gap between us diminishes. You know, it is not enough to not be racist. We need to be anti-racist. We need to highlight it, speak out, and stand against it wherever we see it. But we're also to live by the law of Christ and to truly love one another. That's how people who don't look like me need to experience me. And it's how they need to experience you too. Look, in a couple of weeks, in fact, in a month after George Floyd died, a day is being highlighted for churches in Suffolk to stand together and to pray into this whole situation. I'm going to keep you posted as more details kind of get sorted on this. Hey, but thanks again for listening, and I hope that you'll join us on Sunday at 10:30 as we launch a new series called Better Together. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks.